Most people spend their entire lives believing that intelligence, talent, luck, or motivation are the forces that shape who they become. But the ancient samurai knew a far more brutal truth. A man's entire destiny is determined by a single invisible skill that he either silently commands or unconsciously surrenders, and that skill is attention. Because attention is the lens through which you experience reality, the filter that selects what matters, the gatekeeper of every action, every emotion, every decision, and every direction your life takes. And what almost no one realizes is that attention is not passive. It is not something that merely happens. It is a force you direct, a weapon you sharpen, or a weakness that gets stolen from you every single day. And the samurai understood this with absolute clarity, which is why they trained attention before they trained strength, before they trained strategy, before they ever touched the blade. Because the warrior who does not command his attention will never command his actions, his discipline, or his destiny. And in modern life, this truth is even more dangerous because attention is attacked from every angle: screens, noise, opinions, guilt, comparison, stimulation, emotional triggers, pulling your awareness into 1,000 fragmented directions until your mind becomes tired without ever doing anything meaningful. And this is why people feel exhausted, unfocused, overwhelmed, and lost, not because they lack ability, but because they lack ownership of the one skill that controls everything else. For attention dictates behavior, behavior shapes identity, and identity determines destiny. Meaning the life you live today is simply the long-term result of what you've been giving attention to for years, intentionally or accidentally. And when your attention is scattered, your identity becomes unstable, your discipline weakens, your relationships become reactive, your emotional state becomes fragile, and your goals drift into chaos. But when your attention is disciplined, your life aligns naturally, because where your focus goes, your effort goes, and where your effort goes, your results grow. And this is why lost attention means lost control, because your mind becomes a battlefield without a leader, a place where distractions command you instead of you commanding them. But the samurai did not allow this. They believed that attention was the first and highest form of self-mastery. For without attention, strength is wasted, strategy is worthless, and discipline collapses. And to understand how attention controls everything, you must see the chain reaction it creates within you. Because attention shapes what you think about, what you feel, what you choose, and ultimately who you become. And it begins with behavior, because your actions are always the result of what you focus on. When you focus on temptation, discipline breaks. When you focus on fear, courage fades. When you focus on past mistakes, confidence dies. When you focus on discomfort, progress stops. But when you place your attention on purpose, direction, mission, and action, behavior becomes automatic. And that behavior repeated becomes identity. And that identity built over time becomes destiny. Which is exactly why the samurai were obsessed with controlling their attention more than controlling their enemies, because the enemy outside is nothing compared to the enemy inside, the enemy that whispers distractions, fears, impulses, doubts, and temptations. And most people lose this battle every day without noticing, because they live in a world that weakens the mind while pretending to entertain it. A world of constant stimulation that fragments focus into tiny pieces. A world of dopamine loops that keep you clicking, scrolling, watching, reacting, never choosing, never directing, never commanding. And that is why modern minds are weak, not because people are stupid, but because their attention is pulled apart before it ever gets the chance to grow strong, leaving them mentally exhausted without actually doing anything difficult. And the samurai saw this weakness in a different form centuries ago, which is why they forged the philosophies of Zanshin, the art of sustained awareness, and Mushin, the mind of no mind, the ability to act with perfect focus, without hesitation, fear, or distraction. And these weren't mystical ideas, they were practical weapons that made warriors unstoppable, because they understood that the man who controls his attention controls his emotions, his discipline, his relationships, his money, and his identity.
And in the next section, you'll see exactly how attention runs every part of your life, quietly, invisibly, and powerfully, shaping your reality whether you realize it or not. And once you understand how this works, you will never look at distractions the same way again, because you will realize that every distraction has a price. Every moment of lost attention is a moment of lost direction, and every moment of regained attention is a moment of regained power. And this is why the silent samurai said, "A man becomes whatever commands his focus," because your attention is your life, and the moment you reclaim it, you reclaim everything.
The reason attention now controls your life more than ever before is because modern society has been engineered to fracture it, not strengthen it. And this is why so many intelligent, capable people feel mentally weak, unfocused, emotionally reactive, and stuck despite working harder than ever, because the modern mind is constantly stimulated but rarely trained, constantly reacting but rarely choosing, constantly consuming but rarely concentrating, and this creates a state of mental fatigue without productive effort, where the brain is flooded with inputs but starved of depth. And this is exactly what the samurai would have considered dangerous, because a mind that cannot hold attention cannot hold discipline, and a man who cannot hold discipline cannot be trusted with responsibility, power, or freedom. And yet, modern life celebrates multitasking as intelligence, when in reality it is the fastest way to dissolve focus, because attention is not meant to be split endlessly, it is meant to be directed fully, and every time you divide it, you weaken it, which is why constant stimulation, notifications, short videos, endless news, emotional outrage, comparison, quietly trains your brain to avoid depth and seek novelty, creating a dopamine-addicted loop where nothing feels satisfying for long, effort feels painful, and silence feels unbearable. And this is why people feel mentally exhausted even when their bodies have done nothing difficult, because their attention has been pulled in too many directions without rest or command. And this weakness shows up in every area of life, beginning with discipline, because discipline is not about willpower, it is about attention, the ability to keep your awareness on a task even when discomfort appears, boredom emerges, or resistance rises. And when attention breaks, discipline collapses, because procrastination is not laziness, it is simply attention escaping toward easier stimuli. And the samurai understood this deeply, which is why their training was repetitive, boring, uncomfortable by design, because repetition builds obedience of attention, teaching the mind to stay where it is placed regardless of emotion. And this same principle applies to modern work, fitness, learning, and self-control, because the man who can hold focus on the hard thing while his emotions beg him to escape will always outperform the man who waits for motivation. And attention also controls emotion, because emotion feeds on focus, meaning whatever you place your awareness on grows stronger inside you. Fear feeds fear, anger feeds anger, anxiety feeds anxiety, but calm feeds calm. And most emotional spirals are not caused by events, but by sustained attention on the wrong internal narrative, which is why emotional control is impossible without attention control. Because if you cannot redirect your focus, you cannot redirect your emotional state. And this is why the samurai practiced mushin, the state of no mind, where attention rests in the present moment rather than clinging to fear, anger, or anticipation, allowing emotion to pass without hijacking action. And the same principle governs relationships, because attention is validation, attention is power, and attention is influence, which is why people unconsciously manipulate each other by stealing focus through drama, guilt, conflict, or emotional intensity. And if you cannot control where your attention goes in relationships, you will always be reactive, pulled into arguments you don't need, emotions you didn't choose, and dynamics that drain your energy. Which is why boundaries are not just physical or verbal, they are attention filters, deciding who and what gets access to your awareness. And without these filters, your emotional energy will be consumed by other people's needs, opinions, and expectations, leaving nothing left for your own mission. And attention also controls money,
because wealth is the result of sustained, focused effort over time. And scattered minds stay broke, not because they lack opportunity, but because they cannot concentrate long enough to build anything meaningful. Deep work compounds, shallow work distracts, and the ability to sit with a problem, improve a skill, or execute a plan for long periods without seeking stimulation is the invisible divider between those who progress and those who stay stuck. And this is why attention compounds results like interest, because the longer it stays focused in one direction, the more powerful its impact becomes. And beyond money, attention shapes identity itself, because repeated focus becomes self-image, meaning whatever you consistently think about, consume, and engage with eventually becomes who you believe you are. And this is the most dangerous and powerful part of all, because identity is not something you declare once, it is something you train daily through attention. And if your focus is constantly on weakness, comparison, failure, or escape, your identity will follow. But if your attention is consistently placed on growth, discipline, effort, and responsibility, your identity sharpens. And the samurai knew that identity was forged in small moments of focus repeated over time, which is why they trained zanshin, sustained awareness even after action, teaching the mind to remain present and alert rather than collapsing into distraction. And yet, most people lose this skill because they live in constant input, constant reactivity, and zero solitude, never giving the mind space to strengthen itself, never learning to sit with silence, never learning to direct focus inward without stimulation. And this is why reclaiming attention begins not with doing more, but with subtraction, removing distractions, limiting inputs, choosing fewer goals, and executing them deeply. Because power comes from concentration, not accumulation. And once distractions are reduced, the next step is single-task obedience, placing your attention on one task, one window, one objective without negotiation, because attention strengthens only when it is challenged to stay. And the body must support the mind through physical anchors like breath, posture, and repetitive motion, because the body leads the mind, not the other way around. And finally, time must be armored through deliberate blocking, protecting deep work as a form of self-respect, because discipline creates freedom, and freedom is the result of controlled attention, not unlimited choice. And when applied to modern life, work, training, conversations, emotions, this skill becomes visible immediately, because your presence sharpens, your reactions slow, your decisions improve, and people feel your focus without you saying a word, which is why the Stoics, aligned with the samurai, believed that the inner citadel must be protected above all else, because control the lens and you control reality. And this brings us to the truth the silent samurai lived by. He never tried to control the world, he trained to control his attention, because attention is where life actually happens, and when attention is disciplined, actions follow, emotions stabilize, and identity sharpens. But when attention is scattered, life fragments regardless of intelligence or effort. And this is why mastering attention makes you quietly powerful, not loud, not visible, but effective, because no one can manipulate a man who chooses where his awareness rests. And the moment you reclaim your attention, you reclaim your time, your energy, and your future. And that is when everything in your life begins to move in one direction, instead of tearing you apart.
Most people lose the skill of attention not because they are incapable or undisciplined, but because they were never taught how to protect the mind from the world's constant demands. And in a culture where every second is filled with noise, opinions, stimulation, and emotional triggers, the ability to hold attention becomes rare, almost unnatural, because the average person lives with no internal structure, no mental boundaries, and no solitude, meaning their attention is constantly being pulled instead of placed, reacting instead of choosing, absorbing instead of directing. And this creates a kind of quiet internal chaos, where the mind is always busy yet never still, always stimulated yet never focused, always active yet never effective. And this is why multitasking has become the biggest myth of modern intelligence, because the brain cannot divide attention without lowering the quality of thought, the depth of focus, and the strength of awareness.
And every time a person switches tasks, scrolls for dopamine, or consumes endless input, the mind becomes weaker, more restless, and more dependent on stimulation to feel alive, yet less capable of doing meaningful work that requires discomfort, silence, or concentration. And the samurai understood this centuries before smartphones existed, which is why their training focused on subtraction before addition, removing what weakens the mind before practicing what strengthens it, because a sword is sharpened not by adding metal, but by removing it. And the same applies to attention, which is why the silent samurai attention training system begins with eliminating distractions, not managing them, limiting inputs instead of trying to balance them, and choosing fewer goals executed deeply instead of many goals executed shallowly, because clarity thrives where noise is absent. And once the external clutter is removed, the next step is single-task obedience, a principle the samurai considered sacred, because the mind grows strong only when it is forced to stay with one action, one target, one direction without escape, without negotiation, without shifting attention whenever boredom appears. And this is why single-tasking is not a productivity hack. It is a discipline of the mind, a training ritual that teaches your awareness to obey your intention instead of your impulses. And to support this internal command, the body becomes a tool for anchoring attention through breath, posture, and repeated motion, because the samurai understood that the body leads the mind, not the other way around. And when your breath stabilizes, your posture strengthens, your physical presence becomes rooted, the mind naturally quiets, focus deepens, and awareness sharpens. And this is why so many ancient warrior traditions considered physical rituals an essential part of mental mastery, because the physique is the container of attention. And once attention stabilizes internally, time must be shaped externally through deliberate blocking, not as a rigid schedule, but as armor, a protective boundary that shields your deep work from interruption. Because without defined windows of focus, modern life will endlessly attack your attention through messages, alerts, noise, interruptions, and obligations that feel urgent but deliver nothing meaningful. And once these training systems become part of your daily life, a transformation begins, because attention no longer drifts randomly. It becomes a blade, a tool of precision and direction, and this affects every part of the modern world. Your work becomes deeper and more meaningful because you are no longer multitasking your life away. Your training intensity increases because every rep becomes a meditation. Your conversations become richer because you are fully present. Your emotional regulation becomes stronger because you no longer allow your attention to amplify negative thoughts. And in this way, you begin to live as the samurai lived, centered, deliberate, unshakable, because Zanshin, sustained awareness, teaches you to remain mentally awake even after the task is done, and Mushin, no mind, teaches you to act with total clarity, unhindered by fear, hesitation, or distraction. And these philosophies align perfectly with Stoic wisdom, which teaches that a man becomes whatever commands his attention, because attention is the architect of identity, the protector of the inner citadel, the lens that shapes how you interpret reality itself. And Stoicism warns that if you do not control your attention, the world will control it for you, filling your mind with fear, comparison, desire, anxiety, and noise. And once this happens, you no longer live your own life. You live a life designed by external forces, because the world cannot control you directly. It can only control your attention, and once it controls that, everything else follows: your emotions, your choices, your self-worth, your direction, your destiny, which is why reclaiming attention is not just a productivity skill. It is an act of rebellion, an act of inner warfare, an act of self-liberation. And this is what the silent samurai understood at the deepest level, that power does not come from controlling the world, from dominating others, from becoming louder, stronger, or more visible, but from controlling the one thing that determines every thought, every action, every response, and every step of your future, and that is your attention, because attention is where life actually happens, and a man who commands his attention commands his fate. And the samurai believed that true strength was not the ability to kill an enemy, but the ability to conquer your mind, because the world cannot manipulate a man who chooses where his awareness rests, and no failure can break a man whose attention stays on progress, and no success can corrupt a man whose attention stays on purpose, and no fear can control a man whose attention stays on action. And this is why mastering attention makes you quietly powerful, because while others are reacting, you are choosing. While others are distracted, you are focused. While others scatter themselves across 1,000 impulses, you move forward in one direction with clarity, precision, and force. And this is how your life begins to align, because your attention becomes a compass, your discipline becomes a blade, your identity becomes forged instead of accidental. And in the end, the truth is simple. The silent samurai never trained to control the external world. He trained to control the internal one, because that is where destiny is shaped. And when you reclaim your attention, you reclaim your energy, your time, your direction, and your fate, and everything in your life begins to move with purpose instead of being torn apart by noise, because the moment you master attention is the moment you stop merely surviving your life and start shaping it deliberately with the precision of a warrior.
In the end, every battle you fight, every goal you chase, every emotion you struggle with, every relationship that pulls or strengthens you, every success you build, and every failure you fear, comes down to a single moment repeated thousands of times throughout your life. The moment where you choose or fail to choose, where your attention goes. And this truth is so subtle, most people never see it, yet so powerful it silently governs everything about their existence. Because attention decides what you notice, what you ignore, what you believe, what you doubt, what you fear, what you desire, what you pursue, and what you become. And the reason life feels chaotic, overwhelming, or meaningless for so many people is not because life is inherently chaotic, but because their attention has never been trained to anchor itself, never been sharpened to cut through noise, never been disciplined to stay where it's placed instead of being dragged into comparison, distraction, and emotional reactivity. And this is why the silent samurai saw attention not as a skill, but as a spiritual weapon, the foundation of all mastery. Because a man who cannot hold his attention cannot hold his purpose, cannot hold his standards, cannot hold his values, cannot hold his path, and cannot hold himself. But a man who can place his awareness where he chooses becomes unbreakable. Because focus gives direction, direction gives meaning, and meaning gives strength. And when you combine these three, the world loses its ability to push you around like a leaf in the wind, because you begin living with an internal gravity that pulls your actions, thoughts, and identity into alignment. And this is when you finally understand the secret the samurai lived by. That peace is not the absence of chaos, it is the presence of attention. That strength is not the absence of fear, it is the direction of attention. That discipline is not the absence of laziness, it is the control of attention. And that mastery is not the absence of weakness, it is the ability to return your attention to the mission again and again, no matter how many times it drifts. And when you realize this, a kind of inner awakening begins, because you see that attention is not just a mental skill, but the architecture of your entire reality, shaping the lens through which the world appears, which means when you refine your attention, you refine your experience of life. And when you elevate your attention, you elevate the quality of your existence. And when you fortify your attention, you fortify your identity against doubt, noise, and manipulation. And this is where the transformation becomes undeniable, because you no longer chase validation, you choose direction. You no longer drown in emotion, you direct emotion. You no longer fall into distraction, you cut distraction. You no longer fracture your effort across meaningless impulses, you channel it into one path with precision,
force and clarity. And slowly, without loudness, without theatrics, without needing recognition, you become the kind of person whose presence is felt, even in silence, because your attention is anchored, your awareness is sharp, and your mind is fully under your command. And this is something so rare in the modern world that people will notice it instantly, even if they cannot explain why, because true focus radiates like a quiet power, a calm intensity, a depth that cannot be faked. And this is the real reason the samurai believed that mastery begins within, because once you command your attention, you no longer need to control others, you no longer depend on circumstances, and you no longer fear the unknown, because your inner ground is stable, your inner voice is clear, and your inner direction is unwavering. And when your inner world is disciplined, the outer world cannot break you, because your stability does not come from conditions, but from consciousness. And when you reach this stage, life changes in a way that feels almost supernatural. Problems shrink because your attention no longer magnifies them. Opportunities appear because your attention can finally see them. Relationships improve because your attention becomes intentional instead of reactive, and your purpose deepens because your attention remains loyal to it. And at this point, you realize the greatest truth the silent samurai left behind, that attention is the birthplace of destiny, the root of discipline, the engine of identity, the shaper of emotion, the doorway to meaning, and the core of all power. And the moment you reclaim it, your life stops drifting and begins advancing, quietly, consistently, relentlessly, and with the kind of force that only comes from a mind fully under its own command. Because a man who controls his attention controls his life, and a man who controls his life becomes impossible to stop, impossible to manipulate, and impossible to break. For he walks the world with the silent, unshakable strength of a warrior who is no longer fighting the outside, but mastering the inside. And from that mastery, everything else follows.
In the final breath of this journey, remember this: life does not change in dramatic moments, in sudden inspiration, or in rare bursts of motivation. Life changes in the quiet, almost invisible moments where you decide, sometimes without even realizing it, what you will give your attention to. Because every time you choose to focus on the difficult task instead of the easy escape, you rewrite the kind of person you are becoming. Every time you choose to breathe through discomfort instead of collapsing into emotion, you strengthen the core of your identity. Every time you choose presence over distraction, direction over noise, purpose over impulse, you reinforce the inner warrior who has been waiting to emerge. And this is the truth the silent samurai understood long before modern psychology ever existed, that destiny is not something you wait for, it is something you train for. And the training begins not with swords, not with strength, not with strategy, but with attention. Because attention is the thread that weaves together your habits, your decisions, your emotions, your relationships, your money, your discipline, and your future. And when that thread is loose, the fabric of your life unravels. But when that thread is strong, everything aligns, everything tightens, everything becomes coherent, and suddenly the chaos that once overwhelmed you becomes something you cut through with clarity and calm. And this is where your power truly begins, not in trying to fix everything at once, not in trying to control the world, but in mastering the only place where control is possible, the present moment, the breath you're taking, the task in front of you, the meaning you choose, the thoughts you allow, the energy you direct, and the awareness you protect. Because once you learn to command these, nothing external can take your strength, distract your purpose, or break your spirit.
And this is the message the samurai passed down through centuries of silence, that a man who controls his attention does not need to fear the future because he is building it, does not need to fear failure because he learns from it, does not need to fear judgment because he no longer lives for the eyes of others, and does not need to fear chaos because clarity is his weapon and presence is his shield. And as you walk away from this video, carry this final truth with you. Your mind becomes whatever you feed with attention. Your life becomes whatever you reinforce with attention. And your destiny becomes whatever you consistently return your attention to. So if you want strength, focus on what strengthens you. If you want peace, focus on what grounds you. If you want mastery, focus on what challenges you. And if you want to become the silent samurai of your own life, begin by choosing, right now, where your awareness will rest. Because the moment you master that choice, even for a few seconds, you begin a path that most people will never walk. A path of clarity instead of confusion, discipline instead of drift, purpose instead of chaos, and direction instead of distraction. And from that moment onward, you are no longer shaped by the world. You begin shaping the world within you. And that is the ultimate form of power, the quiet, unshakable power of a man who has mastered the one skill that controls everything, his attention.